Welcome back to the Titanium Hangar. This is Mike, and happy Friday, everybody. Over the last 5 years or so, I've kind of noticed a trend with Masterpiece Transformer collectors. For the most part, Masterpiece Transformer collectors do not collect vintage or the G1, the actual original 1984 to 1989 toy line. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Now, obviously, there are people who collect both, a little bit of everything, but I'm talking about the majority. The majority of the comments and the majority of the people that I've talked to do not collect vintage. So today I've kind of compiled a list of reasons why I think it's kind of an interesting topic to talk about, and we're going to get into this coming up. So first of all, the first reason, probably the most important reason, that Masterpiece collectors do not collect vintage is because they're chasing perfection. They are going after the most definitive version of each character that they can get, and that chasing perfection is Masterpiece, not vintage. And so going backwards to vintage is not what they're looking to do. The vast majority of Masterpiece collectors want the best for their shelf. Even if they have to wait forever to get it, they will wait for what they feel is the best. That's another thing that I hear a lot. I hear, I'll wait for the fan toys, I'll wait for the best one, because they want the most definitive version, and they're not looking to go backwards to a G1 or a vintage. And that's an interesting mindset, an interesting thought process, and I hear it over and over. If you were to look at a Megatron, the vintage Megatron or the G1 version was a terrible figure. I had it as a kid, and even as a kid, I was like, this thing kind of sucks. Does not match the on-screen counterpart at all, but enough of the other ones did, so I still like Transformers. But I had Megatron. I did not like him as a kid. And it's strange, he stayed in gun mode most of the time. But if you compare them side by side, the MP36 Megatron, or actually even any of the third parties, blow this one away. But at the end of the day, for me, I still am a bit of a vintage collector, and I do appreciate the charm of this. I remember the many, many years of messing around with this thing. So with that, it does have its charm, but it's nowhere near as good as MP36. A lot of Masterpiece figures are next level. That next level complexity is also what separates them from the G1. And so a lot of people say they like the challenge, they say they like all the things that you can do with them, all of the posability, but when it gets down to it, there's also little features like being able to hide parts inside of the figure that normally were just left hanging out on G1. So that extra level of engineering, attention to detail, that's something that you just can't get from the original G1s, which were so simplistic. So the next point is value, or value versus price, or what you get out of buying this. Tracking down old G1 vintage toys will get you maybe a little excited, some people really excited, but for the most Masterpiece Transformer collectors say, I could get this Wheeljack over here, a Masterpiece Takara one that is modern engineering, looks amazing in both modes, for when it originally retailed at $63. Now, I don't know what they are on the secondary market, but I just looked up what a complete vintage Wheeljack goes for, and it's over $100. It's astronomical. It's crazy. So with that, they would enjoy something, if they're going to spend $100, a better representation than the original G1. And I understand that mindset. I've been hearing that mindset quite a bit. It's like, if I'm going to spend $100 on something, I want the best that's around. Kind of goes back to point one, but still, the price versus value. What kind of value you're getting if you're buying a $100 secondary market? And some people are asking $260 for theirs because some of these parts are actually getting harder and harder to come by. I do think you can get repro, though, this day and age. Just like Optimus Prime. So Optimus Prime, of course, is a figure that's sought after by almost every figure, but every collector. But when you think about it, are you getting more joy out of a vintage Optimus Prime that you spend $100 to $200 on to try to get one complete? Or would you get more enjoyment out of a Transform Element, a Magic Square, or even a $100 KO of the MP44? So the options that we have these days, the better representations on the shelf versus going back to a G1, yes, you could re-experience all of that. And there are a lot of people that collect this, but I collected this 20 years ago. So nowadays, I don't get the same level of excitement as I do with a Masterpiece release, especially of a character that hasn't been done yet. So the next thing I want to point out is kind of the ease and availability of collecting Masterpiece versus collecting vintage. Now, not always will you find the figure that you're looking for a reasonable price that's complete and have all the parts. But for the most part, if you're keeping up with Masterpiece and you're there when the production run is going on, you do have an option of one Masterpiece that you could get. So if you're keeping up along the way, you could get them a good availability for a reasonable price. And when it comes to vintage, though, there are some items, some pieces that are either non-existent on eBay or any of those platforms, and when they do pop up, they are super expensive, or you just end up getting a bunch of incomplete stuff for a reasonable price. So availability, it's not like you could just go get vintage toys at Walmart. You can't get third party there either, but third party has so many distributor outlets that are around that it makes it a lot easier to get. The next reason is scale. If you were to do a display of vintage, you can make a great looking vintage display. But scale is a massive problem when you try to put specific scenes together, when you try to set up dioramas, and when you try to put together G1 collection on display. You sort of just group them by height for the most part, and that looks good. But the thing about Masterpiece collectors is Masterpiece collectors like to put dioramas or displays or really flesh it out to cover a scene or a group or a squad or whatever, Decepticons all together, the Autobots all together, those kinds of things. But look at the crazy scale issues from one shelf to the other, and this is one of the best looking vintage collecting shelves I've seen in a while. The fact that we have Masterpiece figures that more or less scale properly. We could argue over the Sunbow, an inch here, an inch there, but it's not so far off like it was with G1. G1 was all over the place scale-wise, and that was just because of the nature of where the figures came from. They just took figures from different toy lines, cobbled them together into one, and then down the road they started making their own figures, and there was more cohesive of a set, but it still had problems. Watching Masterpiece collectors these days show their collections, show their displays, it really is impressive what can be done today that could not be done with vintage figures. So the next reason I hear collectors Masterpiece, they want to collect Masterpiece and not vintage, is because they crave something new, but they still are connected to old characters. So the excitement is getting a new representation of an old character. So when it comes to G1, been there, done that either back in the day or did that, been there, done that 10 years ago, and now are moved on to Masterpiece collecting, which is kind of where I'm sitting in my position. So I understand that mentality. I am really excited about the Omnibots, and it's just something that is a bit obscure, but we've never really seen the Omnibots since the original. Other characters like Punch, Counterpunch, just some really cool stuff that we haven't seen in a really long time, and it's something to get excited for. Now, we've seen Hasbro Mainline make this, but see, that's not the same thing. Once you're into collecting the Masterpiece, a premium scale, a premium figure, you just can't fill it in with the Hasbro one. And I tried to make videos about ones that would work, but at the end of the day, Masterpiece usually wins over the Mainline. Now, there are collectors, and I talked about this, that do both their way, however they like to. And I have seen amazing collections. They've sent in amazing pictures of amazing collections, how to integrate Masterpiece and G1, and it's beautiful, just like this collection right here. And I see this, but I don't think it's still a big push for vintage. And I think the excitement for collectors like this that have achieved a certain level of vintage are still getting future Masterpiece releases. So I had a friend of mine that had a really nice vintage collection and was displayed very well, and the way he did it, a whole room was made up, and he did sort of kind of group them by faction, and he used elevations. He did a lot to make it look very well displayed. I should have made that video. I don't have any pictures or video of that, so I'm going to use some other pictures that I have in here. But the thing about it is that I thought he was in G1 forever, and he had kind of been there, done that. He had a few things that he needed to complete it 100%, and I was trying to help him track those items down. He calls me up and says, guess what, I sold it all. And that shocked me. He sold it all, and then I think he was trying to rebuild it again a couple months after that. And then he calls me up a couple months even after that, and guess what he says? I'm into Masterpiece collecting now. Now, this isn't his collection either. These are submissions for the 10,000, 11,000, 12,000, 13,000K specials, but The thing is that he had already been there and done that. He's already collected G1. He had a lot of fun doing it. Really exciting time for him. Then when he found himself trying to do it again, he just didn't have the same passion. It just didn't feel as exciting as, well, now collecting Masterpiece. Having a ball collecting Masterpiece is really exciting, and he's having a lot of fun because he's in a time, or he started at a time, that there were a lot of KOs available. So he got caught up real quick with some KOs, and now he's trying to stay on it with, each release one by one. So I kind of want to round this out by saying that we are starting to see a new trend in Masterpiece where we get updated figures, updated sculpts, but then we're getting them in toy decos so that we kind of have that same toy homage. And that's yet another fun aspect of collecting. Now that's definitely not for everybody, but that is still something that is interesting, and it seems to be exciting to a lot of collectors to not have to go chase down a vintage figure, stay in your realm of upgraded sculpts and upgraded articulation and upgraded transformations and more complex transformations, yet have a bit of a toy look that you remember from years past. There are also excellent KOs of the original vintage. Some of those floating around out there, they call them reissues online if you're wanting to find them, if you're looking to get a couple. And I start to notice that even if Masterpiece collectors don't collect vintage, they find themselves with one character that they want to go back and get. One character that they'll have to pick up. And of course for me it was Swoop, but I collected them all anyway. But I had to get a reissue Swoop to get that beautiful blue chest. So I'm curious, am I hitting the mark on this? If you collect Masterpiece, do you more or less no longer collect G1? Do you collect Masterpiece because you already collected G1, sort of like I did, been there, done that, moving on to the future? Do you collect both at the same time? And if so, which one gives you the most joy and excitement? Masterpiece or the original vintage G1? And the biggest question here is, are you looking more to the future or more back at the past? Let me know in the comments below. Let me know what you think about this topic. Like, subscribe. Titanium Hanger out.